Welcome to Late Night Calm. Tonight we are going to travel somewhere far away and long ago, and we are going to do it slowly. There is no hurry in this place we are going. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to remember, and no part of this you need to hold on to. Let it move past you like water. Let the names arrive and drift away again. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle of it all, that is exactly what this is for. The city will keep breathing without you. The story will carry on down its own quiet streets, and it will still be here, gently unfolding, whether your eyes are open or closed. We are going to a city on a river, a city of stone and wool and gold, tucked into the green hills of Tuscany, in the years between roughly 1350 and 1494. Its name is Florence, and if you had walked into it on an ordinary morning 600 years ago, the first thing you might have noticed, before the towers, before the churches, before the great dome that had not yet been finished, was a small coin passing from hand to hand in the marketplace. A coin of gold, about the size of a modern fingernail, weighing only a little more than 3 grams. They called it the fiorino d'oro, the gold florin, and it had first been struck in the year 1252, long before our story properly begins. It was small enough to lose in the folds of a purse, and yet it was one of the most trusted objects in all of Europe. A merchant in Bruges, a banker in London, a trader on the docks of the Eastern Mediterranean would all take that little Florentine coin and know, without weighing it, without arguing, exactly what it was worth. Other cities copied it. They imitated its weight, its shine, its promise. Because a florin was a promise made in gold that this particular city on its particular river was good for the money. Hold that image for a moment, a tiny gold coin passing quietly from palm to palm. Because everything we are going to walk through tonight, every level of this city, from the very poorest man scraping wool with his bare aching hands, all the way up to the uncrowned prince who ruled it all, everything hangs, in the end, on that little coin, and on where it went, and on how it climbed. Before we begin to climb, let yourself settle. You do not need to sit up. You do not need to follow closely. Let your shoulders come down from wherever the day has pushed them. Let your jaw loosen. Feel the weight of your body pressing gently down into the bed, into the pillow, into the soft dark. Let the day loosen its grip on you, finger by finger, until it lets go entirely. Your breathing can slow now. There is nothing left to solve tonight. There is only this quiet voice, and this old city, and the slow walk we are going to take through it together. And if you find these gentle journeys through history soothing, if this is becoming a small part of how you fall asleep, you might. Whenever it suits you, like this video or subscribe or leave a soft word in the comments below. It costs you nothing, and it helps other tired minds find their way to a calmer place, one peaceful night, one sleepy soul at a time. But that is all. That is the only thing I will ask of you. For now, there is nothing to do but rest and listen, and let Florence rise slowly out of the dark. Now, let's begin. To understand this city, you first have to understand that the people who lived in it did not think of themselves as one people at all. They divided the world in two, and they did it with a pair of words that tell you almost everything. There were the popolo grasso, and there were the popolo minuto. The popolo grasso. The words mean, quite literally, the fat people. Not fat in body, but fat in fortune. These were the wealthy merchants, the great bankers, the men who belonged to the important guilds, the families whose names carried weight in the council halls. And then there were the popolo minuto, the little people, the small people, the wage labourers, the ones who worked with their hands for a daily coin, the ones who belonged to no guild and held no office, and had, when you came right down to it, no voice at all in how their own city was run. The fat and the little. That was the map of the world in a Florentine's head. And it is at the very bottom of that map, in the streets of the little people, that we are going to start our climb. Not at the top, with the gold and the marble and the famous names. At the bottom. In the cold morning, with a man whose hands are already sore before the sun is fully up. Let us go and stand beside him. He works with wool. Almost everyone at the bottom of Florence worked, in one way or another, with wool. The wool trade was the engine of the whole city, the great churning heart of its economy. And it had been for generations. In the years of its peak, back in the 14th century, the workshops of Florence turned out cloth by the tens of thousands of bolts a year. One old chronicler, a man named Giovanni Villani, wrote that in his day the city produced perhaps 70 or 80,000 cloths in a single year, though he may have been generous with his numbers. The way proud men often are about the things they love, and more careful modern estimates for later years settle closer to 30,000. But even 30,000 cloths is a staggering river of fabric flowing out of one city. Enough to clothe a great slice of Europe, and every single one of those cloths passed through the hands of the little people first. Through hands like his. His name we will never know. He is one of the countless men history did not bother to write down. But his work we know very well. He is a wool comber, or a carder, in the language of the city, a pettinatore, or a scardassier. Say those words slowly to yourself, and let them go. Pettinatore, scardassier. They are just the names for a man who takes raw wool, greasy and tangled and full of burrs and dirt straight off the animal's back, and pulls it again and again through rows of sharp iron teeth until the fibres all lie the same way, clean and straight, and ready to be spun into thread. It is simple work. It is also brutal work. He does it hour after hour, and the wool is harsh, and the lanolin cracks the skin, and the iron combs snag and pull. And by the end of a long day his hands are raw and stinging and stained. There were men like him whose whole role was even simpler and harder still, the battilano, the beater, whose job was to beat the raw fleece, to loosen it and clean it, hour upon hour, a rhythm of dull blows in a room full of floating fibres and dust. And here is the thing you most need to feel about this man if you are going to understand the whole city stacked above him. He was paid by the day. A giornata, they called it, a day's wage for a day's work. Not a salary, not a steady sum you could count on. A single coin or a handful of small coins handed over at the end of a day of labour, and then the same thing again tomorrow, if there was work tomorrow. And often there was not. The wool trade rose and fell with the seasons, with the shipments of raw fleece, with the demand from far-off markets he would never see. When the work was there, he worked, and he was paid his giornata. When the work dried up, he simply was not paid, and there was nothing to be done about it, and no one to appeal to. His whole life balanced on that thin daily coin, with nothing underneath it. No savings to speak of, no cushion, no guild to catch him if he fell. That word, guild, is the one to hold on to, because its absence is the whole story of his powerlessness. In Florence, if you belonged to a guild, you were somebody. You had rights. You had a place in the machinery of the city. You could, in time, hold office. The guild looked after you, defended you, buried you when you died. But the wool comber belonged to no guild. He was not allowed to. The lowest workers of the wool trade were, by law, forbidden to organize, forbidden to band together, forbidden to form a guild of their own or to bargain as one. They were the ungilded. And so they had no voice, not in their wages, not in their working conditions, not in the government of the city they kept clothed and fed with the sweat of their hands. Instead of belonging to a guild, they were ruled by one. High above them, far above their reach, stood the great wool manufacturers' guild, the Arte della Lana. It was one of the most powerful institutions in all of Florence, and the men who ran it were among the popolo grasso, the fat people, the ones who owned the workshops and sold the finished cloth and grew rich on the labour of the combers and the beaters and the spinners. The Arte della Lana did not protect the little wool workers. It disciplined them. It policed them. It set the rules they had to follow and punished them when they broke them. And to do that policing, the guild employed a particular kind of official, an outsider, a man deliberately brought in from another city so that he would have no local loyalties, no cousins or neighbours among the workers he judged. They called him the ufficiale forestiero, the foreign official. It was his job to keep the ungilded workers in line, to hear complaints against them, to hand down punishments. Imagine the shape of that. A man brought in from elsewhere, a stranger with no ties to you, given the power to punish you, employed by the very people who profited from your labour and set your wages, while you yourself had no guild, no vote, and no way to answer back. That was the legal weather the wool comber lived under every day of his working life. And yet, and hold this gently because it is beautiful in its own hard way, this same man, with his raw hands and his daily coin and his silence, was part of something enormous. The cloth he helped to make was famous across the known world. To turn a filthy fleece into a bolt of fine Florentine wool that a nobleman in another country would pay a small fortune for, that cloth had to pass through more than 20 separate operations, more than 20 distinct pairs of hands, more than 20 different skills. Let them wash over you, slowly, the long patient chain of it. First the raw wool had to be sorted, the good from the coarse. Then beaten, to loosen and clean it, that was the Battilano's dusty labour. Then washed. Then combed or carded, our man's work to straighten the fibres. Then spun into thread, most often in the homes of women out in the countryside and the poorer quarters, the spindle turning by lamplight. Then the threads warped and set upon the loom. Then woven, the shuttle passing back and forth, thousands upon thousands of times, until a length of raw cloth grew slowly on the frame. Then fulling, the cloth pounded and soaked to thicken and tighten it. Then teasing, to raise the soft nap on its surface. Then shearing, to trim that nap smooth and even. Then dyeing, to give it its rich colour. Then the final finishing, the pressing and the folding, until at last it was ready to be sold. More than 20 steps, each one a separate trade, a separate pair of hands, a separate small payment. And here is the quiet cleverness of how the city arranged all this labour. Much of it was not done in one great factory under one roof, the way we might picture work today. It was scattered, it was handed out. The merchant or the workshop master would send the wool out to a spinner's cottage, out to a weaver's home, out to a dyer down by the river, and gather it back again at each stage, a little further along, a little more finished. They called this the putting out system. The work was put out into the homes and the small shops of the city and the surrounding countryside, the contado, and drawn back in again. It meant that the making of a single bolt of cloth reached like a web into hundreds of humble lives, into a cottage where a widow spun by candlelight, into a room where a family carded together, into a shed by the water where a man dyed his hands blue and red and never quite washed the colour out. And running through all of it, binding all of it together, was the river. The Arno. You cannot understand the wool trade without the river, because the river was where so much of the dirty, watery, heavy work had to happen. The fleece was washed in it. The finished cloth was washed in it. Mills along its banks, turned by the current, powered the great wooden hammers that pounded the cloth in the fulling stage. And so the districts where the dyers and the tanners worked clustered close to the water, and they were not gentle places to stand. The dye vats steamed with their strange colours. The tanners, curing leather nearby, filled the air with a stench so strong that the wind carried it through whole neighbourhoods. This was not the perfumed Florence of the picture books. Down here, by the water, it smelled of wet wool and animal grease and the sharp reek of the dye pots, and the streets ran with the runoff of a dozen trades. Not far off, spanning the Arno, stood a bridge lined with shops built right out over the water, the Ponte Vecchio, the old bridge, crowded with stalls where, in those days, butchers and other tradesmen sold their wares out over the current, tossing what they did not want straight into the river below. So picture the whole of it now, laid out in the soft dark. The river, brown and busy, the mills turning, the dye vats steaming, the homes scattered through the poorer quarters where wool was combed and spun. And at the heart of it, our man, the pettinator, bent over his iron combs in the grey morning light, pulling the fleece straight, one stroke after another, so that somewhere far away, months from now, a person he would never meet could wear a coat of fine Florentine cloth and never once think of the raw hands that began it. He would earn his giornata tonight, if there was work. He would go home. He would sleep, perhaps, the deep, dreamless sleep of a body worked to its limit. And he would have no vote, no guild, no voice, and no expectation that any of that would ever change. Except here is where the story turns, and it turns in a way that no one standing in that wool workshop could ever have imagined. Because these men, these voiceless, ungilded, day-wage men at the very bottom of the city, did, once, for a few astonishing weeks, rise up and seize the government of Florence with their own raw hands. Let me tell it slowly, because it is one of the most remarkable things that ever happened in this city, and it deserves to be told gently. It was the summer of 1378. July, the lowest wool workers of Florence, the combers and the carders and the beaters, the men of the popolo minuto, had a name that the city used for them. Half in scorn, they were called the Ciompi. And in that hot July, the Ciompi did what they were never, ever supposed to be able to do. They stopped working. They gathered. They armed themselves with whatever they had. And they marched. They rose up against the guilds that ruled them and the government that ignored them, and they poured through the streets. And they took the great buildings of the city's power. They seized the very heart of Florentine government, the palace where the rulers sat, the Palazzo della Signoria. The men with the raw hands and the daily coins walked into the halls where they had never been allowed a voice, and for a moment the whole order of the world turned upside down. And they did not simply riot and scatter. For a brief, extraordinary window they governed. They forced the creation of new guilds, guilds for the previously ungilded, guilds for the little wool workers who had always been forbidden to organize. Overnight, at least on paper, the men at the very bottom had what had always been denied them: a guild, a place, a voice. And it went further still. They raised up one of their own to the highest office of all. A wool comber, a man named Michele di Lando, one of their own class, a worker with wool-stained hands, was made gonfalonier, the standard bearer, the very head of the Florentine government. For a few weeks in the summer of 1378, a wool comber stood at the summit of the city, holding the banner of the Republic, in the palace that men like him had been forbidden even to enter. Sit with the wonder of that for a moment, in the quiet. The lowest man in the city, the man paid by the single day, the man with no guild and no voice, holding, however briefly, the highest office the city had. It was as if the whole ladder we are about to climb had, for one dizzy summer, been turned over on its head. But, and you may already feel the shape of this, the way these things so often go, it did not last. It could not last. The forces arrayed against the Ciompi were immense. The wealthy, the popolo grasso, the great guilds, the men who owned the workshops, and the wool and the money, they did not intend to let the world stay upside down. The radical new government, the moment of the little people's power, was fragile from its first day, and the powerful moved against it. Within weeks, within a few short months, the rising was broken. The armed workers were pushed back, their leaders scattered or turned, and the old order closed over them again like water over a dropped stone. And in the years that followed, one by one, the new guilds, the guilds that had, for the first time, given the little wool workers a name and a voice, were taken apart and abolished. By the year 1382, just 4 years after that astonishing July, it was as though the Ciompi rising had never happened at all. The new guilds were gone. The combers and the beaters were once again ungilded, once again voiceless, once again paid by the single uncertain day, once again policed by the foreign official of the arte della lana. The wool comber went back to his combs, and the ladder stood upright again, exactly as it had before, with him at the very bottom of it. But it had happened. That is the thing to carry with you into sleep. For a few weeks in 1378, the man with the raw hands held the banner of Florence. And even after they crushed it, even after they abolished the new guilds and pretended it had all been a fever that passed, the memory of it stayed in the city like a splinter that never quite worked its way out. The men at the top would never entirely forget that the men at the bottom had once, however briefly, come pouring up the ladder and taken the whole thing in their fists. It changed how the powerful thought about power. It reminded everyone, forever after, that the silence of the little people was not the same thing as their contentment, that a city built so steeply, with so much gold gathered at the top, and so many bare, aching hands at the bottom, was never quite as stable as it looked on a calm gold coin morning. And that is the strange and quiet lesson of the very first rung of our ladder. That the man who seemed to have nothing, no guild, no vote, no name that history bothered to record, was not, in the end, entirely powerless. That the whole magnificent city, all the marble and the gold and the famous names still waiting for us further up, all of it rested, in the most literal way, on his hands, on the combing and the beating and the washing and the spinning, on the giornata paid at dusk, on the long, patient 20-step river of labour that turned dirty fleece into the cloth of Europe. Take away the wool comber, and the whole tower above him has nothing to stand on. So we begin at the bottom, with him, in the grey morning by the loud brown river, with his hands already sore. And we will climb from here, slowly, rung by rung. We will meet the artisan next, the one lucky enough to belong to a guild, the one who swore an oath to his trade and opened a shop that was also his home. And beyond him the merchant, and beyond the merchant the banker, and beyond the banker, at the very top, the strange uncrowned man who ruled a whole republic without ever quite admitting that he did. And at every level, from the comber's daily coin all the way up, we are going to watch the same quiet thing happen. We are going to watch the money move. We are going to watch it climb, rung by rung, the little gold florin passing from hand to hand and gathering, always gathering, toward the top. But that is all still ahead of us, waiting in the soft dark, in no hurry at all. For now we are still down here at the bottom, where the story began, standing beside a man whose name we will never know, listening to the iron combs pull through the wool, and the river running past, and the great sleeping city breathing all around us in the dark. There is a way the city thought about itself, a simple map it carried in its head, and it helps to hold that map now, here in the dark, before we climb. Florence divided its people, in its own words, into two kinds. There were the popolo grasso, the fat people, and there were the popolo minuto, the little people. It sounds almost like a joke, said out loud, fat and little. But the Florentines meant it plainly, and it was not really about the body at all. The fat people were the wealthy ones, the merchants and the bankers and the men of the great guilds, thick with money and thick with the influence money brings. And the little people were everyone below them who worked with their hands for a wage. The spinners and the weavers and the dyers. And beneath even most of those, thinnest of the thin, the man we are standing beside. The comber. He had names, this work of his, real names in the old tongue. If he pulled the long iron combs through the fleece to straighten the fibres, he was a pettinator, or a scardasier, a comber, a carder. If his job was to beat the raw wool, to loosen it and clean it before anything else could be done, he was a battilano, a wool beater. These were among the lowest paid and least secure hands in the whole enormous trade. He was paid by the giornata, by the single day, or sometimes by the piece, so much for so much finished. And a day's pay is a fragile thing to live on. When the work came, he worked. When the work thinned, in the slow seasons, the coin thinned with it. And there was nothing underneath to catch him. No savings to speak of, no cushion, just the next day, and whether the next day had wool in it. Here is the part that is easy to miss, lying here in the warm dark, and it matters more than it seems. He had no guild. Every trade that mattered in Florence gathered itself into a guild, an arte. A brotherhood that set the prices and the standards and cared for its own and buried its dead and above all gave its members a voice in the city. The comber had none of that. The ungilded workers were forbidden by law to organize, forbidden to gather and bargain, forbidden to speak with one voice. And they did not stand under a guild that was theirs. They stood under the discipline of the Arte della Lana, the great wool guild, which was run by the very men who employed them and profited from them. The Lana kept an official to police the workers below it, a man deliberately brought in from outside the city so that he would owe no local loyalties and feel no local mercy. He was called the Ufficiale Forestiero, the foreign official. His job was to watch the ungilded, to catch them if they gathered, to punish them if they stepped out of line. Imagine that for a moment. A man too poor to have a voice, working with sore hands for a coin a day, watched over by a stranger paid to keep him quiet. And yet the whole shining city needed him, needed all of them, needed this river of the poor. Because the wool trade was the engine of Florence, and it was an enormous and intricate engine. One piece of cloth, one single length of the fine wool that Florence sold across all of Europe, did not simply appear. It passed through more than 20 separate operations before it was ready to sell. The raw fleece had to be sorted and beaten and washed and combed or carded and spun into thread and warped and woven and fulled and teased and sheared and dyed and finished. More than 20 distinct pairs of hands, more than 20 distinct skills, and many of them done not in one grand factory, but scattered out across the whole city. This was the putting out system. A merchant would hand the wool out, stage by stage, into the homes of the poor. A woman spinning thread by her own hearth, a family combing in a rented room. The work reached into 1,000 small dwellings and drew them all together into one long chain that ended in a bolt of cloth worth a fortune. And the river ran through all of it. The Arno, brown and loud and cold in the morning, was not scenery. It was part of the machine. The fleece was washed in it, the finished cloth was washed in it. The fulling mills that pounded the cloth thick were powered by it. And along its banks clustered the dyers and the tanners with their vats and their stench, the parts of the trade that the fine people upstream preferred not to smell. Take the comber and the spinner and the weaver and the dark river, and you have the true foundation of Florence. Not the marble, not the gold. This, the patient, aching, invisible labour of the little people. Now here is the thing about people with no voice. Sometimes, once in a long while, they find one anyway. Because in the summer of one particular year, in July of 1378, the lowest of these workers did something that should have been impossible. The Ciompi, which was the name given to the very poorest of the wool workers, the combers and the carders especially, the men without a guild and without a vote, put down their tools and rose. They did not merely complain. They poured through the streets, and they seized the government buildings, the very seat of power, and for a short and astonishing moment the bottom of the ladder stood at the top of it. They forced the city to create new guilds for the ungilded, to give the voiceless a voice at last. And they raised one of their own, a wool comber named Michele di Lando, to the highest office the Republic had. They made a comber the gonfalonier, the standard-bearer of justice. Picture that. The man with the iron combs and the sore hands, standing where the great merchants stood. It did not last. We will come, in time, to how the story of that summer ends, to how the new guilds were swept away, and the old order closed its fist again by 1382. That thread we will leave gently open for now, resting in the dark, unfinished, waiting for us. For now it is enough, drifting here, to know that it happened at all, that once the bottom rose. And so we climb. The ladder of Florence had many rungs, and the distance between them was not measured in steps, it was measured in paper, in oaths, in the name of a guild carved above a doorway, and whether your name was the kind of name that could be carved there too. Because here is the thing that held the whole city together, and also held most of it down. Florence was, at its core, a city organized by guilds. And the guilds were not merely professional associations, the way we might think of them now, a group of people in the same line of work who gather occasionally and share a newsletter. No, in Florence the guilds were something closer to the walls of the city itself. They were the border between who counted and who did not, between the man with a voice and the man without one. There were 21 of them in all. 21 arti, the Florentines called them, the arts, the crafts, the organized trades, and they divided cleanly into 2 tiers, a shape that mirrored the city's own division between the popolo grasso and the popolo minuto, between the fat people and the little people, though within the gilded world even the smallest man was larger than the one outside. The first tier held 7 guilds, 7 arti maggiori, the major guilds, the great ones. These were the guilds of the men who mattered most, whose wealth and reach and prestige placed them at the pinnacle of what a craftsman or merchant could be in Florence. The judici e notai, the judges and notaries, the men of written law who drafted the contracts by which the city breathed. The calimala, the great cloth finishers and importers who bought foreign cloth, often coarser northern weaves, and transformed them into something finer and more Florentine before selling them again across the world. The cambio, the bankers and money changers, whose tables sat at the heart of the city's commerce, exchanging coin for coin and promise for promise. The lana, the wool guild, which you already know something of, the arte della lana, that oversaw the great engine of the wool trade, and beneath whose authority the ungilded combers and carders did their invisible work. The seta, also called the Por Santa Maria, the silk guild, whose trade in fine silks would rival and eventually surpass the wool trade as the century wore on. The Medici e Speziali, the physicians and apothecaries, whose name carries a certain resonance when you consider the most famous family in the city, though the Medici who would come to rule Florence were bankers, not doctors, and the echo in their name is a matter of some historical charm rather than direct guild affiliation. And the vaiae pellicii, the furriers who dressed the bodies of the wealthy in the pelts of animals brought from the cold edges of Europe. 7 great guilds, and below them 14 more. The arti minori, the minor guilds, were 14 in number, and they covered the broad middle of the city's working life. The butchers, the shoemakers, the blacksmiths, the innkeepers, the tanners, the linen workers, the oil merchants, the locksmiths, the armourers, the bakers, and others besides. These were the guilds of the men who kept the city fed and shod and housed and armed and lit by candles. Not as grand as the merchants and bankers, but gilded, and therefore by the measure that mattered most in Florence, real, 21 in all. And the thing that made them matter was this: political life in Florence ran through the guilds. To be a member of a guild, to be matriculated, enrolled in its records, sworn to its statutes, was to be a citizen in the fullest sense the city recognized. Your voice, such as it was in this particular republic, existed inside the guild. The guild was the door. Without it you were merely present in the city, the way a stone in the road is present, bearing weight, worn by the passage of everyone else. This is why the wool comber had no vote and no recourse. He was not in a guild. The arte della lana policed him, but he was not of it. He was beneath it. The guild was the roof of a house he was not allowed to enter, and for the man who was inside one, the oath he swore on entering was not a formality. It was the central act of his professional life. When a man matriculated into his arte, when his name was entered into the guild rolls and he was received as a member, he swore. He stood before the guild, and he bound himself, in language both sacred and legal, to the statutes of his arte. He promised to abide by its rules, to submit to its judgments, to support its members. to uphold its standards. He was promising, in effect, to be accountable, not just to his customers, not just to himself, but to the body of men who shared his craft and whose collective reputation rested on whether he did his work well or poorly. The guild set apprenticeship terms. It determined how long a young person must study and serve before he could be trusted with his own shop, his own tools, his own sign above his own door. And the beginning of that service came early. Apprenticeship in the Florentine trades typically began somewhere around the age of 10 to 14, sometimes earlier. A boy would be placed in a master's workshop, living and working under that master's roof, learning not just the techniques of the trade, but the whole shape of a craftsman's life. How to prepare materials, how to deal with customers, how to manage a workshop, how to move through the professional world of the city with whatever combination of pride and humility the guild expected. This could last years, many years, and after the apprenticeship there might be further years as a journeyman, a lavorante, a hired hand, working in someone else's shop, saving money, building skill, waiting for the day when he could afford to open his own bottega and take on apprentices of his own. The guild also inspected work. Officials of the arte could examine what a master produced, check it against the standards the guild had set, and penalize or even publicly shame a man whose work fell short. Quality was not merely a matter of personal pride, it was a matter of collective honor, and the guild enforced it with something very like legal authority. And when a member died, the guild buried him, or helped to. This was not incidental. In a world where a proper Christian burial was a profound spiritual necessity, and where the costs of sickness and death could destroy a family overnight, the knowledge that your guild stood behind you in the end was not a small comfort. It was one of the deepest reasons to belong. Think of it this way. The guild was a kind of second family, one made not of blood, but of trade. It was the structure that gave a working man's life its shape, its meaning, its protection, and its limits all at once. And at the centre of that life, in Florence, was the bottega. Say the word slowly, the way a Florentine might have said it on a warm afternoon, opening his shutters to the street. Bottega. It meant workshop. It meant shop. It meant, in many cases, home. The bottega was all three things in one, and the fact that it was all three things at once is one of the most important facts about how work and life were organized in this city. The master artisan did not commute, he did not leave his home and travel to a separate place of work. He worked where he lived, and he lived where he worked, and the two were separated, if at all, only by the thickness of a wall or the depth of a room. The shop front opened to the street, the shutters folded down to form a counter or display surface, and passers-by could look in and see the master at his bench, surrounded by his materials, his tools, his unfinished pieces, his garzoni and lavoranti moving around him. The garzoni were the younger ones, the apprentices and errand boys, still learning the smallest tasks, still at the very bottom of the workshop hierarchy. The lavoranti were more experienced, journeymen, in effect, men who had moved past the early stages of apprenticeship and could be trusted with more complex work, but who had not yet opened their own establishments. In a thriving workshop on a busy street, you might have a master, 2 or 3 lavoranti, and several garzoni all in the same room at the same time, each at a different stage of their working life, each watching and being watched. And here is one of those moments where the specific weight of history lands softly on something you might almost overlook. Two of the most celebrated names in all of art, two names that have travelled 5.5 centuries and still carry their full charge, Leonardo and Michelangelo. Both passed through the Florentine bottega system in exactly this way. Leonardo, the son of a notary, was placed around the age of 14 in the workshop of a sculptor and painter named Andrea del Verrocchio, whose bottega stood in Florence and whose work covered a remarkable range, from bronze sculpture to painting to goldsmithing. Leonardo entered as an apprentice, living in the workshop, grinding pigments and preparing panels, and watching how a master handled a brush and a chisel, learning not just technique but the whole integrated practice of making things. He was a garçono first, and then a lavorante, before he eventually struck out on his own. Michelangelo, a generation later, was placed at around the same age in the workshop of the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of the most successful fresco painters in Florence, whose bottega produced work for the city's great families and churches. Ghirlandaio's shop was a proper business, with assistants and apprentices and a steady flow of commissions, and Michelangelo learned there the practical discipline of the working artist, even as his gifts were already straining at the ordinary limits of what a bottega was meant to teach. Both of them shaped by the same system, the same structure of oath and apprenticeship and daily proximity to a master's hand. The thing that looks to later eyes like solitary genius was, at its roots, collective and methodical and organized by guild. Let that settle for a moment. The open street, the folded shutters, the smell of paint or wood or metal, the younger boys watching the older hands, the city making its people one bottega at a time. Now there was another kind of community that cut across the ladder in a different way, softer than the guild, looser in its structure, but no less real in what it provided: the confraternities. These were lay religious brotherhoods, associations of ordinary people, not clergy, not monks, not members of any religious order, but ordinary citizens and workers who gathered in the name of a shared devotion. A confraternity might be dedicated to a particular saint, or to the Virgin, or to a devotional practice like lauder singing, the singing of hymns of praise. And their membership could reach across the lines that the guilds enforced so carefully. An artisan and a labourer might belong to the same confraternity. A merchant and a lesser shopkeeper might pray together in the same hall, march in the same procession, offer each other the same small dignities. What the confraternities offered was something the guilds only offered within their own tier. They offered belonging. Not professional belonging, not the belonging of shared trade and shared statutes, but something warmer, something older, the belonging of people who prayed together and cared for one another in extremity. Because the confraternities also did practical work, they offered charity to their members in times of illness or poverty. They provided a proper, dignified funeral and burial for those who could not otherwise afford it. They organized the almsgiving and the care for the genuinely destitute. In a city where plague could arrive without warning and strip a family of its breadwinner overnight, a confraternity membership was not a spiritual luxury. It was a form of insurance, a quiet safety net woven of faith and mutual obligation. For the artisan who belonged to a guild, the confraternity added another layer of community. For the worker who had no guild, the confraternity might be the only organized collective body that acknowledged his humanity at all. The men of the popolo minuto, the ungilded, the poor, could not vote through a guild because they had none. But many of them belonged to confraternities. They walked in processions, they sat in candlelit halls and sang. They buried each other. It was not nothing. It was, in the narrow life of the little person, quite a lot. And it reminds us that Florence, for all its stratified ruthlessness, was also a city with an interior life, a devotional life, a life of ritual and gesture and shared meaning that ran through all the levels of the ladder, even the ones money had almost forgotten. But money, as we said, is what moved this city. And now the ladder rises again. Above the artisan, above the man with his guild oath and his bottega open to the street, there was a figure who worked with neither chisel nor loom, at least not directly. He worked with correspondence and credit and the careful management of distances. He was the mercante, the merchant exporter, and his reach extended far beyond the streets of Florence. Out through the hills and across the mountains and over the sea to places that most Florentines would never see. The great Florentine fortunes were not made by making things, not finally. They were made by moving things, by understanding, better than almost anyone else in Europe, how to coordinate the flow of raw materials and finished goods and money across enormous distances and multiple currencies and unpredictable conditions, and to emerge on the other side of that complexity with more than you started with. The wool trade, the engine we have already traced from the comber's hands through 20+ stages of labour, was fueled at its most literal level by raw material that came from very far away. The finest English wool, grown on the backs of sheep in the Cotswolds and the Welsh marches, was among the most prized in Europe, and Florentine merchants spent a great deal of energy and money acquiring it. Spanish wools arrived through different routes. North African fleeces made their way across the Mediterranean. All of this had to be purchased, transported, insured against loss, documented, delivered, and paid for across distances that could take weeks or months by the standards of the day. The mercante who orchestrated this was not, himself, carrying bales of wool on his back. He was writing letters. He was maintaining relationships with agents in other cities, men he trusted, or at least understood how to trust within limits, who could act on his behalf in markets he could not personally attend. He was drafting contracts and keeping accounts. He was managing risk, or trying to, across a landscape where a ship could sink, a war could close a road, a sovereign could default on a debt, and a plague could kill the agent you had relied on for 15 years. And the finished cloth, after all those hands and all those stages, after the beating and the washing and the combing and the spinning and the weaving and the fulling and the teasing and the shearing and the dyeing, after all of that, the finished cloth went the other way. Out through Florence's gate, down to the ports, across to the customers of Europe and the Levant who would pay Florentine prices for Florentine quality. The wool trade was, for a long stretch of the 14th and 15th centuries, the beating heart of the Florentine economy. At its peak, in the earlier part of this period, the workshops of the city were producing tens of thousands of cloths in a year. The chronicler Giovanni Villani, writing in his own time, claimed something like 70 or 80,000 cloths in a single year, though modern historians tend to read his numbers as enthusiastic rather than precise, and later periods show more conservative figures, perhaps around 30,000. The range matters less than the scale. It was enormous. It employed a large fraction of the city's population, either directly or in the putting out work that spread across homes and neighbourhoods beyond the workshop walls. But here is something worth pausing on, because it touches a part of the process that mattered enormously and is easy to overlook. Dyeing cloth, giving it those deep permanent colours that made Florentine fabric worth the price it commanded, required a very specific ingredient. Without it, the dye simply washed out. The colours did not stay. And the ingredient, the substance that fixed dye to cloth and let colour become permanent, was alum. Alum is a mineral salt. Not glamorous, not dramatic to look at. But to a cloth merchant, to a dyer working over his vats, alum was as necessary as water, and sourcing it reliably was one of the constant logistical concerns of the textile trade. For a long time, much of the alum used in Europe came from sources in Asia Minor, controlled by parties who were not always convenient to deal with and who could set prices according to their own interests. Then, in the 1460s, something happened that changed the balance considerably. Large deposits of alum were discovered at Tolfa in the hills of the Papal States, not far from Rome. And the discovery was not merely geological good news, it was a political and financial event of the first order. Because the Medici, who already had deep connections to the papacy through their banking business, obtained a significant role in the organization that controlled this new supply. The arrangement came to be known as the Societas Aluminum, the Alum Company, and it tied together three things that the Medici excelled at: banking, trade connections, and proximity to papal authority. Think of what this meant in practice. The Medici were already handling the finances of the Pope. They were already banking the revenues of the Church across Christendom, moving money from distant dioceses to Rome, and earning the favour of the highest spiritual power in the Western world. Now they also had a hand in the supply of a key industrial raw material that almost every cloth-producing city in Europe needed. Their banking interests, their cloth trade interests, and their papal connections were no longer three separate things. They were one interlocking system, each part reinforcing the others. The merchant at this level of the ladder was not just a businessman. He was an architect of connections. He understood that money moved differently when it moved through networks, when each relationship was also an asset, when the trust between correspondent agents in different cities was itself a form of capital that had to be maintained, cultivated, and occasionally spent. The mercante's office, if you could call it that, would have been dense with paper. Letters received and letters waiting to be answered. Accounts kept in careful order, recording every transaction, every debt owed and every debt due, every consignment sent and awaited. Samples of cloth, perhaps, pinned to documents describing their quality and destination. Invoices from shipping agents. Correspondence from partners in Rome and Venice and Bruges and Lyon and London. Each written in the careful, formulaic language of international commerce, where precision in the description of goods and sums was not mere pedantry, but a matter of financial survival. And threading through all of it, invisible but essential, were the instruments that made this whole apparatus possible across the distances it had to cross. The Fiorino d'Oro, the gold florin, first struck in 1252, weighing about 3.5 grams of pure gold, was the coin that made Florence's reach possible. By the 15th century, it had become one of Europe's most trusted international currencies, accepted across the continent and imitated by other mints who understood what the florin's consistency and purity signified to a merchant who needed to move value across borders. You could do business in Florence, send goods to Bruges, sell cloth in London, and trust that the florin would be recognized and honored at each end of the chain. But even the florin, solid as it was, could not travel easily across the Alps or across the sea. Carrying large amounts of gold coin was dangerous. It attracted thieves. It was heavy. It was slow. and moving it to settle accounts between cities required the gold to physically change hands, which was cumbersome and costly at every stage. So the merchants of Florence, and not only Florence, had developed something that did much of what coin did, but without the weight and the risk. A piece of paper, essentially, a letter of credit, a promise, backed by reputation and by the dense network of correspondent relationships that the great merchant houses maintained across Europe. This instrument, which we will come to understand more fully as we climb higher, was the lettera di cambio, the bill of exchange, and it was in its quiet way one of the most consequential inventions in the history of money. Not an invention of machinery or of art, an invention of paperwork and trust. But we are getting ahead of ourselves on the mechanics. The merchant at this rung of the ladder used these instruments without fully examining them here. He accepted them as the air he breathed professionally. The bill of exchange was simply how you settled accounts between cities, how you moved value without moving metal, how you turned a complex, geographically dispersed trading operation into something that could actually be managed by a person sitting at a desk writing letters. What the merchant knew, what every man at this level of the ladder knew, was that the instruments worked if the network held, if the correspondent in Bruges was solvent and honest and alive, if the road between Florence and Lyon was passable, if the political arrangement between two states did not suddenly make crossing a border treacherous. Commerce at this level was not safe. It was managed risk, which is a different thing. And the men who managed it most successfully were not the most reckless. They were the most methodical, the most patient, the most careful about which relationships they cultivated and which they let go. Somewhere behind the merchant, keeping everything legible, was a system of record-keeping that had been evolving for generations. The wool comber kept no accounts. The artisan might keep a simple ledger of money owed and money paid. But the merchant at his level needed something more sophisticated, a way of recording every transaction that let him see, at a glance, the full state of his finances, what he owned and what he owed, what was coming in and what was going out, all balanced and checked against each other so that an error would eventually surface and betray itself. The system that the great Tuscan merchants had developed was called partita doppia, double-entry bookkeeping. Every transaction recorded twice, once as a debit on one side, once as a credit on the other, so that the two sides always balanced and any discrepancy was immediately visible. It was elegant in the way that good mathematics is elegant, not because it was beautiful to look at, but because it was true, because it captured reality precisely and allowed reality to be examined and questioned. A friar named Luca Pacioli would eventually print a systematic description of this method in his great work, the Summa de Arithmetica, published in 1494. His account became famous, and his name has been attached to double-entry bookkeeping ever since. But it would be a mistake to think that Pacioli invented it. By the time he sat down to describe it in print, Tuscan and other Italian merchants had been practicing the method for well over a century. Pacioli wrote it down. He made it available to anyone who could read a printed book. But the merchants of Florence and their predecessors had been balancing their books this way long before he gave it a name in ink. This is worth knowing, not to diminish Pacioli, who was a remarkable scholar, but to understand what kind of city Florence was. It was a city where the practical intelligence of commerce had been developing, accumulating, refining itself for generations, inside the heads and ledgers of working merchants, before it ever became the subject of formal description. The theory followed the practice. The writing down came after the doing. And it is one of the things that distinguished the merchant at this level of the ladder from everyone below him. He carried in his head and on his pages a model of the world expressed in numbers. He could look at a page of his accounts and see the state of his business not as a story told in words, but as a structure of debts and credits, assets and liabilities, a map of where things stood that was more precise in its way than language alone could be. This was a kind of literacy, a different kind than reading and writing, but in its own domain equally powerful. Now let the counting house recede for a moment. Let us think about what it meant to live inside this city, somewhere in the middle of its many rungs, neither at the very bottom nor anywhere near the top. To be an artisan in good standing, a member of one of the arti minori, say a shoemaker or a blacksmith or a linen worker, with a bottega open to the street and a few lavoranti at work, and a name on the guild rolls, and a candle burning in the confraternity hall on feast nights. You lived in a city that was physically not very large by modern standards, 30 or 40,000 people after the plague, perhaps more as the decades passed and the population slowly recovered. You could walk across it in under an hour. You knew your neighbourhood, your street, the face of the man who ran the shop opposite. You knew the smell of the Arno on a hot day, which was a particular smell, and not always a pleasant one, the tang of the dye vats and the tanneries and the fulling mills clustered near the water, the whole industrial life of the city concentrated along that brown river. You knew the sound of the bells. Florence was a city of bells, each church and tower speaking its own voice at its own times. The great bells of the cathedral and the smaller bells of the neighbourhood chapels, marking the hours and the feasts and the deaths and the emergencies. You learned to read the bells before you could read a page. They were the city's clock and its weather vane and its nervous system all at once. You walked to work, which was also home. You opened your shutters in the morning, and the street came in, the noise of it, and the light of it, and the people passing, and you were immediately in commerce with the world, not separated from it by a commute or a boundary, but simply present in the flow of the city's day. Your guild told you what you could charge. Roughly, it told you how to handle disputes with customers or with other members. It told you that if you fell ill, there was a claim you could make on your arte's charity. It told you that when you died, your brothers in the guild would carry you to your grave. Your confraternity told you that you were not merely an economic unit, that you had a soul and a spiritual community, that on certain nights and certain feast days you would dress in the robes of the brotherhood and walk in procession through the streets of the city, and that this too was a real and serious thing. And underneath all of it, visible and invisible at the same time, the money moved. Up from the hands of the combers and the beaters, through the bottega of the weavers and the fullers and the dyers, into the accounts of the cloth merchants, out through the gates of the city on the backs of horses and mules, and in the holds of ships. Across Europe and back again, transformed into profit, denominated in florins, recorded in double-entry ledgers, moved through the networks of the great houses by letters of credit and bills of exchange. The man with the iron combs and the sore hands and no guild and no vote was at the beginning of a chain that ended somewhere he could not see and could barely imagine. The artisan with his sworn oath and his open bottega was a little further along, his labour a little more his own, his place in the city a little more real, a little more legible to the city's own accounting of itself. The merchant exporter, writing letters to Bruges, counting alum in the Tolfa hills, watching the balance in his double-entry books, was further still. And above him, somewhere in the city's dense and quiet upper air, there were men who had moved so far up this chain that they had ceased to be tradesmen in any ordinary sense at all. Men who did not move cloth or wool or even alum. Men who moved money itself, who understood, more deeply than anyone around them, that money was not the end of the chain but the medium of it, the thing through which everything else was converted and transmitted and ultimately controlled. We are climbing toward them. We are not quite there yet. But feel the city around you for a moment as it breathes its 15th-century breath. The bells, the Arno, the smell of the dye vats, the open shutters of 100 botteghe, the clatter of looms and hammers, and the softer sound of a brush against a panel in a master's studio. The confraternity singing somewhere in a nearby chapel, voices joined in the dark of a stone hall. The merchant at his desk, pen in hand, the candle casting its small circle of light over the numbers that were his whole world arranged on a page. This was Florence, and the ladder went higher still, the men who moved money itself. Think of what that meant, for a moment, in a city the size of Florence. Not moving wool, wool you could touch, weigh, smell, carry on your back. Not moving cloth, cloth you could fold, unfurl, hold up to the light. Not even moving a ship, or a cartload of alum from the Tolfa hills down to the coast. Those were real things, graspable things, things that wore out your hands and dirtied your coat and left you with something to show for the day. Money was different. Money was a kind of abstraction that the 15th century was only beginning to understand in its full strange depth. A gold florin in your hand, a fiorino d'oro, about 3.5 grams of metal, the size of a large button, worn smooth at the edges by 10,000 hands before yours, was real enough. You could bite it. It had weight. It had the reassuring presence of something the world agreed was valuable. But what the great merchants and bankers of Florence had discovered, over generations of careful practice and careful thought, was that you did not need to move the florin itself. You could move the idea of the florin, the promise of it, the record of it. And that was a discovery that changed everything. Every successful merchant in Florence by the 15th century kept his accounts in a particular way. Not the way a householder might scratch numbers on a scrap of vellum, a rough record of what came in and what went out. The method the merchants used was something more rigorous than that, and more elegant. Every transaction entered the books twice, once on the left side of the page as a debit, once on the right side as a credit. Not because the merchant was writing it down twice for caution's sake, but because every exchange, when you thought clearly about it, had two sides. If you gave something, someone else received it. If you received something, something else was given. The books reflected this duality, line by line, entry by entry, so that when you added up every column and compared them, they had to balance. Had to, by the logic of the system itself. This was partita doppia, double entry. The Tuscans had been practicing it in its mature form since at least the 14th century. It grew up among the merchant families of Italy the way a craft grows up, passed between partners, refined in the counting house, tested against the brutal arithmetic of profit and loss. By the time a Franciscan friar named Luca Pacioli sat down in 1494 to write his Summa de Arithmetica, a vast and meticulous summary of mathematical knowledge, the first printed work to describe the method systematically, it was not a new invention. It was a practice already a century or more old. Pacioli wrote it down, explained it clearly, made it available to the literate world in print. He did not invent it. The merchants of Florence and Genoa and Venice had worked it out long before any friar had set it to paper. But the significance of partita doppia in a city climbing its ladder was not purely practical, though the practical significance was enormous. What double entry did was make a merchant's entire financial world visible at once. You could look at the books and know at any moment exactly what you owed, what was owed to you, what you held in goods, what you had sent out on consignment to an agent in Bruges, what profit or loss a given enterprise had yielded. It turned commerce into something that could be measured, compared, planned, and in a world without the instruments we take for granted. No limited liability corporations, no stock exchanges, no central banks. This ability to see and account for complex flows of wealth across distance was itself a form of power. Imagine a merchant, not the great banker, not yet, but a prosperous merchant exporter, sitting at his desk in the evening, the day's business done, the books open before him. The candlelight falls across two columns of figures. He enters a purchase on the left, raw wool, bought from an English factor, paid in the currency of that agent's city. He enters its mirror on the right, the corresponding outflow from his cash account. The books absorb the transaction, and the balance holds. Every shipment, every payment to a dyer or a shearer or a carrier, every advance to a factor in Lyon, all of it flows into this same double record, each entry finding its opposite, each entry making the total picture a little clearer. This was how you ran a business across 3 countries with no way to know what was happening in your agent's city until a letter arrived weeks later. The books were the intelligence, and Luca Pacioli, when he finally wrote them down in 1494, was encoding something that had already been running the commercial world of Italy for generations, but the books alone could not solve the merchant's deepest problem. And that problem was this. Money is heavy. It is also dangerous to carry, easy to steal, and completely lost if the ship goes down or the road gang attacks the courier. A gold florin in your hand is worth exactly a gold florin. But a gold florin in Florence, when you need it in London or Bruges or Rome, might as well be a stone in your pocket. You cannot do business with a stone. The solution that the Florentine and other Italian merchants had worked out over the preceding century or more was a document called the lettera di cambio, the bill of exchange. Think of it this way: a merchant in Florence wants to send money to an agent in Bruges, a substantial sum, not something you load on a mule and trust to a road. Instead, he goes to a Florentine banker and pays him a certain sum in florins. The banker gives him a letter. This letter instructs the banker's correspondent in Bruges, his partner, his agent, his own branch, to pay out the equivalent amount to the merchant's man in Bruges, in the local currency there, at a date several weeks in the future. The merchant's problem is solved. He has moved money across Europe without moving a single coin. The banker, in exchange for providing this service, collects a fee. And that fee was the thing that made the whole system simultaneously brilliant and theologically complicated. The church of the 15th century, the church that gave the last rites, that determined who could be buried in consecrated ground, that held. In the popular imagination, the keys to paradise and the ledger of hell condemned usury. Usura, the lending of money at interest, profiting from the mere passage of time, was a sin. Not a minor sin, a comfortable sin one could confess and move past. A grave one. Dante Alighieri had placed the usurers in the seventh circle of hell, in the burning plain under the rain of fire, squatting and weeping, each one with a purse hung around his neck, bearing the coat of arms of his family, identifiable in damnation by the emblem of his earthly wealth. The message was clear. The sermon preached it. The poet immortalized it. Lend money for profit, and you are burning among the worst. And yet Florence ran on credit. All of Europe ran on credit. You could not finance a wool shipment from England to Florence without advancing money you would not see returned for months. You could not build a merchant empire without lending and borrowing across currencies and distances. The gap between what the Church commanded and what commerce required was absolute, and it had to be bridged somehow. The lettera di cambio was the bridge. Here is what made it legal, or at least arguable. When a Florentine banker accepted a deposit in florins and instructed his Bruges correspondent to pay out the equivalent in the local currency of Flanders weeks later, the exchange rate between those two currencies could, and did, shift in the interval. The profit the banker earned was not called interest. It was called the difference in the exchange rate. It was not the price of time. It was the price of currency risk, of the service of transfer, of the fluctuation of markets. Technically, legally, theologically, it was exchange, not usury. The distinction was thin. Everyone involved understood perfectly well that the banker was profiting from the deployment of money over time, which is precisely what usury is. But the mechanism was different enough, the legal and theological argument subtle enough, that it held. The bankers hired learned men to construct the argument, and the learned men constructed it. Some churchmen accepted it, others did not. The debate ran for centuries, and meanwhile the bills of exchange kept moving and the Florentine fortunes kept growing. What the lettera di cambio did, underneath all its theological dressing, was allow a banker to earn a return on capital deployed across distance and time, without ever calling that return by the name that would condemn him. And because it was denominated in different currencies and settled at different times, it also allowed the banker to operate in every major commercial city in Europe simultaneously, turning the network of correspondents and branches into something that began to resemble, at its most successful, a continent-wide financial operation. And no one understood that better than the family who would make their name synonymous with it. Giovanni de Medici founded what we call the Medici Bank in 1397. He was not the first of his line in banking. He came from a family with modest commercial roots, but he was the one who built the institution. Not in the way a modern person might picture a bank, a grand building with columns and a vault. A bank in 15th-century Florence was something smaller and stranger than that. It was a set of partnerships, a series of agreements between Giovanni and the men who managed each of his operations in different cities. In Rome, a partnership. In Venice, another. In the cities where trade flowed, Geneva, then Lyon, Bruges, London, Milan, a corresponding arrangement. Each one a legally distinct entity. Each one with its local manager holding a share of the equity. This structure was not accidental. It was deliberate, and it was clever in the way that a legal arrangement devised by experienced men over many years of practical necessity is clever, not flashy, not ideological, just quietly effective. If the Bruges branch made a catastrophic loan and collapsed, and this was always a possibility, because you were lending to merchants and princes, and both were capable of spectacular default, the disaster in Bruges did not, in theory, drag the Rome branch into ruin with it. Each partnership was its own legal vessel. The parent held them together through equity and oversight, but the walls between them provided a kind of insulation. It was, in essence, an early form of what we would recognize, at great distance, as a holding company structure. A parent organization coordinating semi-independent subsidiaries, each carrying its own risk. The Florentines did not have those words. But they had the practice, and the practice worked well enough through the 15th century's middle decades to make the Medici Bank the most powerful financial institution in Europe. The branches spanned the continent: Rome, Venice, Milan, Geneva, and then Lyon, following the trade fairs as they migrated. Bruges, the great northern entrepot where English wool and Flemish cloth and Mediterranean luxuries all converged. London, where the English crown and the English wool merchants were customers. The network was not just a list of cities, it was a set of relationships maintained through letters and agents and the physical movement of the bills of exchange that connected one end of the continent to the other. But the branch that mattered most, the branch that was, in a very real sense, the foundation on which everything else rested, was not in any of those northern cities. It was in Rome. The Rome branch of the Medici Bank managed the finances of the Apostolic Chamber, the Pope's accounts. Think about what that meant in 15th-century Europe. The Catholic Church was not simply a religious institution, it was the largest and most complex administrative organization in the Western world, with revenues flowing in from every Christian kingdom, tithes, fees, indulgences. Payments for papal appointments, income from church lands, contributions from every diocese and monastery and cathedral chapter from Portugal to Poland. All of it flowed, in one form or another, toward Rome. And in Rome it had to be collected, accounted for, and distributed to pay the papal bureaucracy, to fund the papal building projects, to finance the papal armies and the papal diplomacy. Moving money at that scale, across that many countries and currencies, required exactly the kind of instrument the Florentine bankers had spent generations perfecting. The lettera di cambio, the network of branch correspondence, the double-entry books that could hold it all in view, and the Medici, through their Rome branch, had the contract. When a bishop in England paid his fee to Rome for the confirmation of his appointment, that payment often moved through Florentine bankers, through the Medici network, as a bill of exchange. When the Pope needed to transfer funds to his ambassador in France, the same network handled it. The Church's revenues were enormous. The slice the bank earned on each transaction was small by percentage. But the volume was vast, and the relationship gave the Medici something beyond money. It gave them access. A banker who sits at the center of the Pope's finances is not just a service provider. He is a confidant. He knows the state of the Church's accounts, the pressures the papacy is under, the resources it can bring to bear. He sits, by virtue of his position, at a particular intersection of money and power that very few people in the world can occupy. And the men who built the Medici Bank understood, Giovanni di Bicci understood, and his son Cosimo understood even better, that this position, properly maintained, was worth more than any single loan or any single commission. Banking the Pope was the foundation of the Medici fortune. It was also the foundation of everything that would come after. And so the machine ran, the lettera di cambio, moving money invisibly across the continent, the double-entry books making the movement visible and accountable, the branch partnerships distributing the risk. And at the centre, the Rome contract, the papal accounts, the endless flow of church revenues through the Medici's carefully maintained hands. It was a machine that made extraordinary profits. And with extraordinary profits came an extraordinary problem. The church damned usury. The bankers had found a way around the letter of that condemnation through the mechanism of exchange rather than direct interest. But the broader anxiety was not so easily managed. A man who grew rich through money, through finance, through the complex instruments of international banking, was a man whose relationship to the sin of avarice was, in the eyes of the church and the popular preacher and the penitent's own conscience, not entirely comfortable. And the Florentines were nothing if not conscious of this discomfort. Dante's usurers burned. The image was vivid and specific and had been in the popular imagination for a century by Cosimo's day. A banker who had built his fortune on the movement of money, who had hidden interest inside the exchange rate, who had profited from the papal accounts while the Pope blessed the faithful. Such a man might lie awake in the small hours wondering, in the honest privacy of his own mind, what exactly he had purchased, and whether the cost would fall due somewhere he could not spend his way out of. The answer the great Florentine families arrived at over generations was visible. You could walk through the city and see it. It was cut in stone and painted in pigment and built in limestone and marble and terracotta. This was magnificenza. Magnificence, not vulgarity, not the loud conspicuous consumption that the sumptuary laws were designed to suppress, the excess of buttons and the immodest length of a sleeve. Magnificence was something the humanist writers of the period had thought about carefully, drawing on the old philosophers, on Aristotle's discussion of the liberal man who spends rightly on great things for the common good. Magnificence was spending on what endured, on what served the city and served God, on buildings and chapels and paintings and libraries and ceremonies that anyone could see, that anyone could benefit from, that would remain long after the man who paid for them had died and been buried, and one prayed, forgiven. The logic was not purely cynical, though the strategic element was always present. A man who paid for a church was not simply buying insurance against damnation. He was also expressing a genuine piety. The two could coexist, and in the 15th century they very often did. But the strategic element was real and acknowledged. Money spent on magnificence bought memory. It bought presence. It bought a kind of legitimacy that money spent on palaces or jewels or banquets could not purchase, because magnificence served others, while luxury served only oneself. Cosimo de Medici understood this more deeply than almost anyone of his generation. He had inherited from his father, Giovanni di Bicci, not just the bank and its profits, but the position, the delicate, powerful, never quite formalized position of a man whose wealth made him the most important private citizen in Florence. And Cosimo spent those profits on a scale that even his admirers found remarkable. San Marco. The church and convent of San Marco in Florence, where the Dominican friars lived, and where the painter Fra Angelico was at work in the 1440s, creating the frescoes that would fill the cells and corridors with a vision of sacred history so quiet and so luminous that it seemed less like decoration than revelation. Cosimo paid for the rebuilding of San Marco. He paid for the convent, for the cells the friars inhabited, for the library that held books collected from across the Italian world. He paid for all of it, in sums that the contemporary bookseller and chronicler Vespasiano da Bisticci, a man who admired Cosimo and cannot be taken as a neutral source, but whose testimony reflects the scale of the impression Cosimo left on those who knew him, described as staggering. Cosimo reportedly said of these expenditures that money spent on such works bought him not only God's favour, but the memory of the city. That sentence, preserved through the admiring accounts of men like Vespasiano, deserves to be read carefully. It is not modest, it is not merely pious, it acknowledges, directly, that magnificence purchased something earthly as well as something heavenly. Memory, the city's memory, the kind of permanence that outlasts the man and even the bank. And then there was San Lorenzo. The great church of San Lorenzo was the Medici parish church, the neighbourhood church, in the oldest sense, the church where the family had worshipped for generations. Cosimo funded its rebuilding under Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect who was already the most celebrated builder in Florence, by virtue of what he had accomplished elsewhere. San Lorenzo, rebuilt on Cosimo's money, became one of the great architectural statements of the century. Calm and rational in its proportions, with the grey stone Pietra Serena marking the structural logic against the white plaster walls, a building that spoke of order and clarity in the same language that double entry spoke of order and clarity. Every line of it measured and composed, every column standing exactly where reason required it to stand. It would be completed over years and generations, with contributions that continued long after Cosimo. But the impulse, the money, the commitment, those were his. And the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, the Cathedral of Florence, whose octagonal drum had stood open to the sky for decades, because no one could figure out how to roof it without the traditional wooden framework that a span that wide would have required in quantities no one could find or afford, had been completed structurally in 1436. Filippo Brunelleschi's achievement was one of the genuinely extraordinary feats of engineering of the century, a masonry dome of a size that had not been attempted since antiquity, raised without a full centering framework, its two shells interlocking, the herringbone brickwork distributing the weight in a way that the dome itself resisted the outward thrust and held its shape. The largest masonry dome in the world. The Arte della Lana, the Wool Guild, oversaw the cathedral works through its Opera del Duomo, the construction authority. The guild that stood at the top of the cloth trade, whose wealth derived ultimately from the labour of men like the pettinatura and the battilano, the wool comber and the beater, paid for the most visible thing in the Florentine skyline. There is something in that connection worth dwelling on. The dome that could be seen from every part of the city, that announced Florence to travellers approaching across the Arno Valley, that was the visual signature of the city's ambition and its faith. That dome was funded, in part, by the same institution that employed the Ufficiale Forestiero to discipline the ungilded workers who had no guild of their own and no voice in the city's affairs. The chain ran from the comber's hands to the lantern on the dome. It was not a chain anyone drew attention to, but it was there. And then there was the council. In 1439, Cosimo de Medici did something that combined the diplomatic, the theological, and the financial in a way that was characteristic of him at his most effective. The Council of Ferrara, a great ecclesiastical gathering, convened to address the question that had divided the Christian world for centuries. The question of whether the Eastern Church in Constantinople and the Western Church in Rome could be reconciled, could find their way back to unity after the schism that had separated them, was moved to Florence. Moved because Florence could house it. Because the logistics of hosting such a gathering required resources and organization on a scale that few cities could manage, and because Cosimo made it possible. The Council of Ferrara-Florence met in the city in 1439 and produced, briefly, an agreement of union between the Eastern and Western churches, an agreement that did not ultimately hold. but whose significance in the moment was enormous. The Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos was present. The Patriarch of Constantinople was present. Scholars and theologians from the Greek-speaking East came to Florence, bringing with them manuscripts and ideas that the West had largely lost, the texts of Plato in their original language, the Neoplatonic philosophy that had been buried for centuries under the accumulated Latin tradition. Cosimo paid for much of this. He hosted the Byzantine scholars. He was present at the great debates. And when the scholars departed, some of their ideas and their manuscripts remained in Florence, seeding what would become, in the decades that followed, a remarkable flowering of Platonic learning centered around a scholar named Marsilio Ficino, whose circle would become one of the intellectual ornaments of Lorenzo's Florence a generation later. The council was, among other things, a display of magnificenza on a civic scale. Florence as the meeting point of the Christian world, Cosimo as the man who made it possible. The connection between the banker's money and the city's international stature, that connection was on public display for anyone who cared to read it. Imagine what it meant in a city where legitimacy flowed through guild membership and electoral process, to be the man who could bring the Emperor of Byzantium and the Pope's legates and the Patriarch of the East to your city, not by holding the office of Gonfalonier, not by virtue of any crown or title, simply by being the man whose resources made the thing possible, whose network of relationships and financial instruments made the logistics feasible, whose standing in the eyes of popes and kings and merchants was such that his invitation carried weight. This was the other thing that Magnificenza purchased. Not just memory, not just God's favour, influence, the quiet, enormous, undeniable influence of the man who pays. And so the picture assembled itself over Cosimo's long years, the years from his consolidation of power after 1434 to his death in 1464, as a portrait of something genuinely new in the world, a private citizen who exercised the functions of a prince while holding almost none of the formal titles. The money the Medici Bank earned on its bills of exchange, on the papal accounts, on the 100 transactions that flowed through its branches every week, was converted into buildings and paintings and the patronage of scholars, converted into the favour of popes who remembered who had handled their accounts, converted into the goodwill of the Florentine families who had benefited from Cosimo's loans and his political protection. Converted, through all of this, into something that functioned like power, that produced the effects of power, that could be passed from father to son the way power was passed in kingdoms, but that wore the clothes of private wealth and civic virtue and Christian piety. Art as atonement and as advertisement, architecture as theology and as politics, patronage as the conversion of coin into something the church could not condemn and the city could not ignore. The wool comber, sleeping in his rented room near the Arno with the smell of the river still on his hands, earned perhaps a giornata and spent it before it was earned. The artisan in his bottega, oaths sworn, apprentices in the corner, shutters open to the street, earned a little more and held a little more. The merchant at his desk, books open in the candlelight, lettera di cambio ready to be sealed, had already moved so far up the chain that the comber's world was barely visible to him. But above the merchant, in the careful arithmetic of Florentine life, were the men who had learned that the most valuable thing was not to move goods or even to move money, but to be the medium through which money moved, to hold the accounts, to write the bills, to sit at the centre of the network and let the city's commercial life flow through you. And those men, The men who had made their bank the keeper of the Pope's own accounts, who had built the branches and negotiated the partnerships and maintained the relationships that made the whole system run. Those men had discovered something further still, something that the wool comber could never have imagined in his rented room, something that the artisan, with his oath, could not purchase with his craft, something that the merchant with his excellent books and his bills of exchange could see only dimly, from a distance. They had discovered that money, moved at sufficient scale through sufficient relationships over sufficient time, did not remain merely money. It became something else. We have not arrived there yet. The ladder has more to climb. But look down from where we stand for just a moment and see what the view already shows. The comber's hands, the artisan's oath, the merchant's ledger, the banker's bill of exchange, and above all of it the dome rising over Santa Maria del Fiore, funded by the Wool Guild, engineered by Brunelleschi, visible from every corner of the city. The most public thing in Florence, paid for, ultimately, by the same chain that began with a man sorting fleece by a river. The city breathes around you. The candle on the banker's desk burns lower. The books are closed. The letters, sealed with wax, are bundled for the courier who will carry them north tomorrow to Bruges, to London, to the great web of correspondents and branches and agents through which the money moves and never quite stops moving. Somewhere in a chapel nearby, a friar lifts a lamp to illuminate a wall where an angel kneels in gold and blue, painted there on Cosimo's money and Fra Angelico's faith, in a silence that has held for 600 years and holds still. And now we come to the question the whole ladder has been building toward. Not who made the money, not who moved it across borders in folded letters sealed with wax, not who prayed over it in chapels painted on its behalf, but who, in the end, was allowed to govern the city that money had made. The answer, in Florence, was the guilds decided. And the guilds, as ever, drew a line to hold office in the Florentine Republic, to sit among the men who set policy, who dispatched ambassadors, who authorized expenditure and made war and peace. You had to be a man. You had to be in good standing with your taxes. You had to be free of significant debt to the commune, and you had to be enrolled in one of the recognized guilds, not the Ciompi's brief and forcibly dissolved guilds, which had lasted only a handful of years before being swept away. One of the 21 legitimate arts, one of the guilds that the state recognized as real. If your name was not inscribed in an arte, it did not exist in the books of government. You were a subject, not a citizen in the active sense. You lived inside the city's walls, but you did not live inside its political life. The body that governed was called the Signoria. At its heart were 9 men, 8 priori, 1 from each of the city's districts, the sestieri, later the quarters, drawn from the eligible guildsmen, plus a 9th man, the most senior of them, who bore the title Gonfalonier di Giustizia, the standard-bearer of justice. It was a title older than the current constitution, carrying the memory of a time when the office had walked into streets carrying a great banner to remind armed factions that the law was still present among them. By the 15th century, the drama was quieter, but the title remained, and the Gonfalonier remained the first among these 9 men who together formed the Republic's executive heart. 2 months. That was the length of a term. 9 men, 2 months, and then they were gone, replaced by 9 others drawn in the same way, living and deliberating together in the same rooms of the Palazzo della Signoria. The great stone palace at the center of the city, its tower rising high above the rooftops, visible from the hills, from the bridges, from almost any street in Florence on a clear day. During their 2 months, the priori lived inside the palace. They ate there, slept there, conducted their business there, and were not supposed to go home even for an evening, so that they could neither be pressured by interested parties nor distracted by personal affairs. 9 men, sealed briefly inside power and then released back into the city as private men again. It was a short term by design, a term so short that any single individual could accumulate very little personal power within it before it ended. A term so brief that no one could get used to the feel of authority without being reminded, within weeks, that the authority had always belonged to the system, not to him. And the method of selection was stranger still, and more beautiful in its intention. The eligible men, those who met the criteria, who were guild members in good standing, whose tax records were clean, who had not been excluded by one disqualification or another, had their names inscribed on small pieces of paper or written on wooden chips, placed inside sealed leather pouches. The borse, they called them. The bags. These bags were kept, under guard, in a chamber of the palace. When it was time to fill an office, a child or a blindfolded official reached inside a bag and drew out a name, and the man whose name emerged was called to serve. Sortition, government by lottery. Not because the Florentines believed that chance was wiser than deliberation, but because they believed that deliberate human choice, of men choosing men, would always be corrupted by faction. If you allowed a council to elect the Signoria, then every election became a battle between competing interests, and whoever won the battle would install their allies in power, and their allies would install theirs, and within a generation the republic would be an oligarchy wearing the costume of a republic. Whereas the bag did not have a faction. The bag did not owe anyone a favour. The bag was simply the bag. There was a further refinement. Before a name went into a bag, a vetting process, called the scrutiny, examined each candidate. Was he eligible? Had he the required years of residence, the required guild membership, the required record? The scrutiny could exclude a name before it ever entered a pouch, and there had been, in the Republic's long and complicated history, other measures as well, provisions by which, in emergency, the normal lottery could be suspended, and names for certain offices could instead be hand-selected by a committee of trusted men. These committees were called accoppiatori, pairing men, the men who paired names with offices rather than leaving the pairing to chance. It was, in theory, an emergency measure, something resorted to in crisis, set aside in calmer times. It became, in the hands of someone sufficiently patient and sufficiently well-connected, something else entirely. One other gate remained on the path to office that is worth understanding. It went back more than a century before the period we are dwelling in to a document called the Ordinances of Justice, issued in 1293. These ordinances had done something radical. They had explicitly barred the great old magnate families, the noble clans who had dominated Florence's earlier centuries through military power and inherited status, from holding the highest offices. The logic was direct. Those families had been too violent, too factional, too willing to use private force to override the law. The popolo, the guild-based citizenry, had decided in a rare moment of unified will to exclude them, to strip the noble name of political privilege and give that privilege instead to the men of commerce. You could be as wealthy and as ancient as any aristocrat in Italy, but if your family bore the magnate designation, the signoria's highest seats were closed to you. It was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential acts of any medieval Italian commune. It said, in this city, political legitimacy flows through trade, through the guild, through the registered and tax-paying citizen of commerce, not through blood, not through military title, not through the feudal inheritance of a sword and a tower. You want to matter in Florence? Open a shop. Join a guild. Keep your books and pay your taxes. And so the great families of Florence became great merchants, because that was the only path to the power they sought. The sword gave way to the ledger. The castle gave way to the bottega. The old nobility reinvented itself as the popolo grasso, and if the conversion was sometimes only superficial. If behind the merchant's register there was still the magnate's contempt for the man below him, the form, at least, required the performance of commerce. Florence had decided that money, not blood, would be the currency of power. It had not yet decided what would happen when one family accumulated so much money and so many relationships, and such a thorough understanding of how the system's mechanisms worked, that the lottery itself became something they could quietly manage. Cosimo de Medici returned to Florence from exile in 1434. He had been sent away the year before, banished by a coalition of enemies who feared what he was becoming. He had gone quietly to Padua and then to Venice, waited, and returned when the political winds shifted, when his allies had worked within the city to alter the composition of the government enough that a new signoria invited him home. The exile had lasted less than a year. But he came back changed in one significant way. He came back with a clearer understanding than ever of how precisely the Republic's machinery could be operated by the hands of a man who understood it thoroughly. He never sought to be a tyrant. He did not want a crown, and it is worth believing him, because a crown would have been both unnecessary and dangerous. A crown announces itself. A crown draws enemies. A crown requires a king to hold it in place against every other man who thinks he could wear it better. Cosimo had something more durable than a crown. He had the bags. Not literally. He did not sit in a vault somewhere pulling names from leather pouches with his own hands. What he had was the influence to ensure that the men who managed the scrutinies, who decided which names were eligible for which bags, were men who shared his interests or owed him favours or depended upon him in the complicated web of credit and relationship that was always, simultaneously, financial and social and political in Florence. The accoppiatori who were empowered to hand-select names for certain offices during emergency periods, those were men he trusted, or men who trusted him, or men who understood that their own standing was bound up in his. A name that should not be there could be kept out of the bag. A name that should be there, a reliable man, a man of the right disposition, a man who understood what was expected, could be ensured a place. And from there, chance took over. But chance operating on a pool that had already been shaped was not quite the same thing as chance operating on the whole of the eligible citizenry. He also made use of the Bala, the Emergency Plenipotentiary Commission. When the Republic faced a genuine or manufactured crisis, a war, a financial emergency, a moment of political upheaval, it was possible to convene a special body called a Bala that was granted extraordinary powers to act quickly and decisively outside the normal constitutional procedures. Bail had been used throughout Florentine history in moments of genuine need. They were supposed to be temporary. Under Cosimo, they became an instrument of periodic constitutional renovation, the means by which the normal rules could be suspended long enough to reshape the political landscape in ways that a more patient system might have resisted. He held office himself from time to time. He served as gonfalonier, he sat in councils, but the number of terms he served as a formal official of the Republic was not proportionate to the 30 years of his influence. For most of those 30 years, he governed from outside the formal structure, or rather from beneath it, in the way that a foundation governs a building without ever appearing in the facade. He was also, throughout these years, doing something with his money that was not merely the laundering of conscience we mentioned earlier, though conscience was certainly part of it. He was purchasing what the Latin writers whose manuscripts his scholars were now reading had called magnificentia, magnificence, the public display of generosity so large and so beautiful that it could not be mistaken for anything other than civic devotion. The rich man who spent on himself was despised. The rich man who spent on the city, on its churches, its hospitals, its libraries, its streets, its walls, was performing a kind of citizenship that transcended the ballot, because it created things that would outlast any particular election and could be seen and used and prayed in by every person in the city, from the wool comber to the notary. The church of San Lorenzo, the convent of San Marco. These were not acts of spending in the ordinary sense. They were acts of permanent inscription. Cosimo was writing his name into the stones of the city in a way that no 2-month term in the Palazzo della Signoria could have accomplished, because the palazzo would eventually hold other men, but the church of San Lorenzo would hold his family's bones. And all of this sat on a foundation of taxation that was itself, quietly, an instrument of rule. The Monte was the city's funded public debt, the device by which Florence borrowed from its wealthier citizens, issuing shares that paid interest and that could be bought, sold, and inherited. Participation in the Monte tied the wealthy to the city's financial health. If the city's credit collapsed, their wealth collapsed with it. It was, in this sense, a brilliant alignment of private and public interest. But it was also a mechanism of dependency, and dependency, like credit, has a holder and a debtor. Beyond the Monte there were direct levies. The decima, the tenth, nominally a tenth of one's assessed wealth, and later the decima scalata, a scaled, progressive version that fell more heavily on the rich. The assessment of wealth for taxation purposes required an official estimate of each household's assets and liabilities, and those estimates were made by men, officials, neighbours, committee members, whose own interests were not always perfectly aligned with neutral accuracy. To be assessed generously, to have your wealth evaluated at less than its true extent, was a gift. To be assessed harshly, to be burdened with an impossible levy, could ruin a man of middling means and slow the rise of a man of growing means. A political enemy could find, in the space of a few tax cycles, that his assessed wealth had increased substantially and that his obligations to the commune had risen with it, draining the capital he needed for his own ventures. Cosimo understood this. It is recorded, with a frankness that might surprise those who imagine Renaissance politics as more genteel than our own, that he was known to suggest the fiscal authorities take a closer look at men who had made themselves inconvenient. Taxation was not merely fiscal policy. It was, in the right hands, a form of governance as precise and as powerful as any formal decree. He reportedly said, and the admiring bookseller Vespasiano da Bisticci records this, though Vespasiano's portraits are those of a devoted admirer, not a neutral witness, he reportedly said that states are not governed by paternosters, not by prayers, not by the beautiful sentiments of a man who has never had to hold a difficult thing together against the pressure of people who wish it undone. States require intelligence and patience and a clear-eyed understanding of the actual levers by which they move. He was not wrong, he was also not a saint. The two facts coexisted in him as they coexist in most men who manage great power for a long time, which is perhaps why his city in the end found it possible to honour him. He died in 1464, a slow decline, the physical cost of age settling on a man who had held enormous weight for 3 decades. After his death, the Signoria of Florence, that republic of elected guild members and lottery drawn priori, deliberated and then inscribed on his tomb in San Lorenzo the words Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. A title drawn from Roman history, from the honours given to Cicero for saving the Republic, to Caesar, the same Caesar, it was not lost on anyone who had ended the Republic that gave him the title. A private citizen, technically, a banker, a man who had built a business and cultivated relationships and managed a city as one manages a very large and complicated account, with constant attention to the balance, and on his tomb, Father of the Fatherland. Power passed to his son Piero, known as Piero the Guti, a man whose health was fragile and whose years in charge were few, a kind of long interregnum between Cosimo's patient mastery and the dazzling presence of what came next. What came next was Lorenzo de Medici, il Magnifico, the Magnificent, inherited the family's position in 1469 as a young man of 20, and he brought to the role something Cosimo had never quite possessed, a quality of personal brilliance that made people want to be near him, that made poets write poems for him and philosophers dedicate treatises to him and artists compete for his regard. He was genuinely learned, genuinely interested in the Platonic ideas that Marsilio Ficino and the scholars of the academy his grandfather had patronized were now elaborating in the gardens and libraries the family had endowed. He was a brilliant diplomat, navigating the treacherous balance of power between Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, and the papacy with a skill that kept the Italian peninsula, for a time, in a fragile equilibrium. He was not, by several accounts and by the evidence of the bank's own records, a careful banker. The branches that Cosimo had built and that the careful managers under him had tended, the branch in Bruges, the branch in London, had been extended credit, as branches sometimes extended credit, to rulers who needed funds for wars and who offered the security of future tax revenues or commercial concessions in return. Edward IV of England, Charles the Bold of Burgundy. These were men with large kingdoms and large ambitions, and in the case of both, an imperfect record of repayment. When the political winds shifted, when armies were defeated or thrones changed hands, the repayments did not come. The debts accumulated and the branches weakened, and the careful partnership structure that Giovanni de Medici had designed to limit liability could only do so much when the losses were large enough. The Rome branch, which had been the engine of the fortune, also changed in character as Lorenzo's relationship with the papacy became more complicated, not least after the events of a Sunday morning in April of 1478. It was during High Mass in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, that same building whose dome rose above every street in the city, beneath those very stones that the Arte della Lana had funded and Brunelleschi had raised. A conspiracy had been forming for months, organized by the Pazzi family, rivals of the Medici in banking and in civic standing, who had seen the Medici's grip on Florence tighten over the decades, and who had decided, with the knowledge and encouragement of Pope Sixtus IV, that the grip might be broken if the men who held it were no longer present to hold it. The signal was the elevation of the host, the most sacred moment of the Mass. The moment when, in the theology of the Church, the bread became the body of Christ, and every head bowed and every mind turned inward. It was then, precisely then, that the conspirators drew their weapons. Giuliano de' Medici, Lorenzo's younger brother, was struck many times. He fell and did not rise again. Lorenzo, wounded, was pulled by his companions through a side door into the sacristy, where the heavy bronze doors were pushed shut against the men who came after him. He survived. The conspirators, having failed to kill both brothers, had accomplished something that was neither the clean political replacement they had intended, nor the clear defeat they had hoped to avoid. They had killed Giuliano, wounded Lorenzo, and thrown Florence into a fury. The city's response was immediate and savage. The conspirators who could be caught were killed, some of them by official execution, some by the crowds in the streets. The Archbishop of Pisa, who had been part of the plot, was hanged from a window of the Palazzo della Signoria in his vestments. The body of Jacopo de' Pazzi, head of the family, was eventually dragged through the streets. The Pazzi name was legally erased from Florence, their properties confiscated, their heraldic symbols removed from buildings, their family members exiled or imprisoned. And Lorenzo, who had survived by the smallest of margins on that Sunday morning, emerged from the crisis with a grip on the city that was, if anything, tighter than before. The attempt to kill him had not weakened him. It had, in the strange logic of survival, given him a legitimacy that even 30 years of careful management could not entirely have secured. He had been attacked at Mass. His brother had been murdered in a church. He was a victim, and victims, when they survive, sometimes become something stronger than what they were. The years that followed were Lorenzo's most influential as a statesman and his most troubled as a banker. He negotiated the peace that ended the war, sparked by the conspiracy. He maintained, through skill and patience, the balance that kept the Italian states from tearing each other apart. He continued to patronize Marsilio Ficino's circle and the young artists who came through Florence, a world of Platonic dialogues and unfinished statues and sonnets in the Tuscan vernacular that would be remembered long after the specific political arrangements that made it possible had dissolved. And the bank continued to lose ground, slowly, in the way that a large and complicated structure can lose ground slowly without anyone noticing until the notices are undeniable. The decline was not a single failure, but a long series of small ones. Loans not repaid, branches not properly supervised, the papal relationship strained and altered by the same political complications that followed the Pazzi conspiracy. The Rome branch, which had been the heart of the fortune, lost something of its privileged position. The Bruges and London branches laboured under their bad debts. The alum revenues from the Tolfa monopoly remained, but they were not enough to reverse what was happening elsewhere. Lorenzo died in 1492. 2 years later, in 1494, French armies crossed the Alps and descended into Italy in a campaign that rearranged everything, and Florence in the crisis expelled the Medici. The bank, what remained of it, was effectively seized. The holdings were confiscated or scattered. The branches that had stretched from Rome to Bruges to London were gone or going. What Giovanni di Medici had begun in 1397, what Cosimo had built into the instrument of an entire city's governance, what Lorenzo had sustained through brilliance and declined through inattention, came to its end in the disorder of a decade that changed the shape of Europe. The Republic was restored, genuinely, for a time, before other forms of Medici power would return in later generations in a different shape entirely. But that belongs to another night, another set of facts, another slow walk through another part of the story. What we have followed tonight ends here, at the foot of the ladder we climbed together, looking back at the whole ascent. Look back, then, for just a moment. Let the city arrange itself in your mind like a painting seen from the right distance, where all the separate figures and textures resolve into something you can hold. We began at the bottom. We followed the pettinator through his long day by the river, hands raw from the combing, no guild and no vote, paid by the giornata, policed by the ufficiale forestiero of the Arte della Lana. We watched those same men, in the summer of 1378, put down their tools and seize the Palazzo della Signoria, briefly, impossibly, before the city closed around them again. We learned what their wages bought and what they could not buy. We climbed to the artisan, and we stood with him as he swore his oath to his arte, in a city where that oath was not merely a professional obligation, but the gate through which political life was entered. We walked through the bottega, open to the street, the master at work, the garzoni watching and imitating in the long, slow education of craft, the boy who would become Leonardo standing somewhere in a room like this, learning to see. We attended in spirit the gatherings of the confraternities, those quiet cross-class brotherhoods where the guild artisan and perhaps even the poorer worker could find a community that the political order denied them. We rose to the mercanti, and we learned the long chain of risk and relationship that moved raw wool from the hills of England to the workshops of Florence to the markets of the Levant, and we understood the alum that fixed the dye and the Societas Aluminum at Tolfa that gave the Medici their hand in the cloth trade at its most chemical and essential level. We opened the merchants' books and found them organized in double entry. Every debit balanced by a credit, every loss and gain visible in its columns, a system already mature before Luca Pacioli described it in his Summa de Arithmetica in 1494, because the merchants had needed it long before a friar thought to write it down. We held the lettera di cambio, the bill of exchange, that single sheet of paper that moved money across borders while hiding interest inside the spread of currencies, allowing the banker to serve the church's theology in form while his ledger served a different arithmetic in practice. We understood why Dante placed the usurers in hell and why the bankers of Florence prayed so earnestly and built so many chapels, not only from piety, though piety was real, but from a theology that demanded some visible act of contrition for the invisible profits of exchange. We walked into the Rome branch of the Medici Bank and found there the source of the fortune, the apostolic chambers accounts, the Pope's revenues flowing through Florentine hands, the invisible relationship between a banker and the spiritual authority of Christendom that made one family, in one city, briefly untouchable. We watched Cosimo pour the profits into San Marco and San Lorenzo, into Brunelleschi's great dome and Fra Angelico's gold-lit walls, not only because beauty is its own justification, though it is, but because magnificenza was a doctrine, and a doctrine is a form of argument. And Cosimo was always making an argument. The argument was, I have spent this city's earnings on this city's beauty, therefore my presence here is not extraction, but gift. It is a compelling argument. It was meant to be. And then we arrived at the final question, and we found the answer waiting in a leather bag. Names written on paper. fingers reaching into the dark of a pouch. The Signoria of 9 Priori, living for 2 months in the Palazzo della Signoria, and then released, and then replaced, in the great slow wheel of a republican system designed above all else to prevent the concentration of power. And beneath that system, the accoppiatori, quietly managing the lists of eligible men. And beneath them, the man who chose the accoppiatori, who had returned from a brief exile in 1434 and never left again, not really, not until 1464, when the slow tide of age finally carried him out. Pater patriae, father of the fatherland, on a tomb in a church he built in a city he governed without ever quite saying so. Then Piero, then Lorenzo, the brilliant, the inattentive banker, the statesman who held Italy's balance in his hands like something breakable, who survived a morning in the cathedral that killed his brother, who corresponded with philosophers and sheltered poets and watched the bank his grandfather founded lose its footing, and who died 2 years before the whole arrangement came undone. What the Ciompi had tried to seize by force in a single summer, the Medici acquired by patience over a century. What the comber could not buy with a giornata's wage, the banker could buy with 30 years of quiet management of a city's official memory of itself. The leather bags held the names held the offices held the city. And behind the bags stood a man who understood money well enough to understand that money at sufficient scale becomes something other than money. It becomes the shape of things, the way the streets are lit and who walks them freely, the way the votes are counted and whose counting is trusted, the way a church smells in the morning when the doors are first opened and the incense from the night before still lingers in the dark. Florence still smells like that, in certain mornings, in certain churches. 600 years later, and the wool is gone, and the looms are still, and the bills of exchange are museum pieces, and the leather bags have long since been emptied. But the dome is still there, and San Lorenzo still stands. And somewhere in the floor of that church, beneath the inscription that calls him Father of the Fatherland, the man who ruled without ruling rests in the stone he paid for, in the silence he arranged. If you have enjoyed walking this city with us tonight, if this slow climb from the comber's rented room to the banker's quiet tomb has given you something to rest in, we would be glad if you would leave a thought below, or share this with someone who might find it a gentle place to land. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. And if you are still listening, still here in this careful dark, thank you. There will be a next journey waiting for you on the screen when this one ends. You can simply let it play, and the voice will carry you. Let the city go, now, let the streets empty. Let the Arno find its slow course to the sea, as it always has, indifferent to the guilds and the banks and the leather bags and the names of the men who rose and fell along its banks. Let the dome stand as it stands, a hemisphere of stone suspended on ingenuity and faith and the wool guild's money, asking nothing of you tonight. Let your jaw soften. Let your shoulders find their way down. Let your hands, which have no fleece to comb, no oath to swear, no books to balance, no election bags to manage, let your hands rest. Feel your breathing find an easier rhythm, the way a city finds quiet when the last bell has rung and the last lamp has been covered, and the stones of the streets hold the day's warmth a little longer before releasing it to the dark. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.